Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Robert Lyman, who has come out with Victory to Defeat the British Army 1918 to 1940. And that is, of course, the book I'm holding up here, and this is the topic for this week's episode. And this is, we're going to discuss it by the end as well, but this is kind of how and why the British Army failed when the Germans came into France in 1940. And we're going to take a look at why did they fail to mobilize, why did the British Army fail to rearm after 1918, and to to do that, I think we should take, as you do in the book as well, we should take a look at early early days of the Great War, as we would call it, not World War One. That's what's called. Obviously, they didn't know there would be a World War Two back then, so they called it World War One. So let's begin with, as you say in the book, and this was quite fascinating. This was really the first time that Britain actually had conscriptions on a massive scale that it had for the Great War. So that's what's kind of unique in itself. So let's talk about how the British and a rearming of the British Army, because they were main naval power. But so let's talk a little bit about the process there in the Great War.
Well, there were so many things that were brand new in the Great War, and you're right to call it the Great War. And what people will remember is that Britain never had a continental military commitment. The only time Britain had sent troops in recent memory to the continent of Europe,
Napoleonic campaign, of course,
was the Napoleonic campaign. We might also include the war in Crimea in 1854-56, but actually in continental Europe, there was no psychology of commitment to Europe. And so when war came in 1914, it took everyone by surprise, and Britain did not have an army that was sufficiently capable of matching the large-scale European armies. Britain's army had, from the 1880s, been designed to support the empire. And it was specifically designed for the empire, for protecting parts of the empire. It wasn't designed for mass use in Europe. Of course, the First World War changed all of that. Your point about the conscription is a very interesting one, because by 1916, the middle of 1916, Britain actually had about 4 different armies in Europe. So the Great Battle of the Somme in July 1916 saw 4 original armies coming together. Let me just explain them. The first was the old professional army, which formed the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. Then there were the militia units, or the yeomanry, who were the cavalry. These had been raised in the 1870s and 80s in response to a scare about a potential threat from France. I mean, Britain's always lived with potential threats from France. And then there were volunteers that joined the army in 1914 and 1915. These were Kitchener's men who responded to Lord Kitchener's demands to join the army. So 3 groups of men. And the 4th group, were those who joined under the terms of conscription in 1915 and early 1916. So melding very, very large numbers of men together to form a single army with one doctrine of the offensive, one doctrine of the defensive, had never existed in the British Army before. And this was a really significant, well, certainly not since the days of Napoleon. Even then, they weren't large armies. Britain's army was always dwarfed by that of Napoleon. So this was a real challenge. But one of the most extraordinary things that modern historians, a lot of my friends, have been doing for the last 20, 25 years, is reappraising how the British Army worked between 1916 and 1918, and have determined that actually the British Army, in those 2 years after the first few weeks of the Battle of the Somme, actually became incredibly competent at what we would now regard as combined arms warfare, fighting a formidably capable German army alongside the French army and alongside, from 1917, the Americans, although doctrinally the Americans slotted more into the French army than to the British. And it's a very interesting story, because whilst there's a huge amount of criticism in Britain even today at the nature of the fighting in the Western Front, this criticism is focused largely on the pre-1916 fighting. What we see from the end of July, early August 1916, through to the end of mid-November 1918, is a dramatic transformation in the capability of the British Army, to the extent that by the time the 100 days battles began in August 1918, it was highly effective. And it was victorious in battle. This is quite an extraordinary transformation. Under the same generals that Britain had in 1916, by 1918, it had moved away from the linear defences of the past. It had transformed the offensive into combined arms groups of what we now call manoeuvre, with armour and infantry and artillery moving together, securing and attacking targets of opportunity, not mass targets. Identifying strategic objectives in depth and attacking them rather than seeking battle. One of the big challenges that Britain had always had beforehand was this idea that you needed to seek battle whenever the enemy was found. No, if you start with identifying what the objectives of your advance are going to be, what do you need to do? Do you need to take a canal? Do you need to take a piece of land that's going to give you strategic advantage? Once you've identified what those are, you can then work out what your military offensive needs, how it needs to play out. The idea that you simply advance in serried lines and defeat whoever you find in front of you is frankly a product of a less intelligent past. And this dramatic change between 1916 and 1918 took place in a British army that was rapidly transforming, rapidly understanding the nature of the modern battlefield. And really, for your listeners, I'll just summarize Erlend by saying that actually by the end of 1918, the British Army, led by the Fourth Army under Rawlinson, which had three different corps, it had an Australian corps, a Canadian corps, and a British corps, ended up defeating Ludendorff's army. Now, who would have imagined that in March 1918? And yet, actually, all the seeds were there. In the German offensive in March 1918, much of what the British were able to do at the end of that year was undertaken, but it wasn't sustained. And the great push to Amiens ran out of steam. And it's very interesting that many of the lessons from March 1918 were then adapted by the British. For instance, when the British Fourth Army advance began in August 1918, it began with tanks that weren't being used as tanks. It was associated with tanks who were bringing up supplies, effectively ammunition, fuel, and food. Those are the three things that soldiers moving forward needed. So the German concept of the stormtrooper only worked so long as it was able to be sustained in the long term. Now, the British by the end of that year had absolutely mastered that. The other really quite remarkable thing is that the British had mastered communication with the air. So aircraft were in the air, not bombing everything they saw, but identifying the German strong points. And whenever a German strong point was identified, it would be radioed back to the ground. Artillery would target that strong point, and the infantry would either do one or two things. They would either attack it whilst other troops bypassed it, or they would simply bypass it and leave it alone. The idea that you had to attack a strong point was a tactic of the past. Now you only attack the strong point if it was pertinent to your attack, if it was going to cause a problem or something like that. So you can see very quickly in just those last few minutes how the nature of the offensive had been transformed. And a lot of people forget this. I mean, many of the veterans' records that you can read, public records and letters and memoirs that you read from 1918 onwards, talk about this great victory which they had achieved, and yet which no one now wanted to remember, because after the war, of course, people became fixated on the sacrifice. And Britain lost about 760,000 men dead, and another 250,000 from the empire, so 1 million in total. This was, even in quantitative terms and relative terms, a very large number of dead. And people in the 1920s and 30s focused on the sacrifice. The Remembrance Day ceremonies are focused on the sacrifice, not on the extraordinary victory that was achieved in November 1918. And I think this is a really important thing that we need to remember. In fact, I mean, we would argue, Richard Dunn and I, Richard's my colleague who I wrote the book with, that Ludendorff's armies in 1918 weren't stabbed in the back, as the old Nazi myth has it, but that they were stabbed in the front, in the main, by the British Army. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that it was only the British Army. our book was about the British Army. Many of the lessons the British Army picked up, and the Germans as well, the Germans and the French and the British, and to a lesser extent the Americans, were learning off each other. So we're not arguing that the British Army was first or anything like that. Not at all. In fact, in terms of the stormtrooper concept, the Germans were second because they came after the French. The French developed this pretty well in 1917, but all of these ideas needed to mature and develop before they had effect on the battlefield. It was just so happened that actually the British, under General Rawlinson, managed to pull us together to achieve some really quite strategic effect in between August and November 1918. Now, the big challenge, Erlend, for the book, this is why Richard and I sat down to write the book, was why was the British Army so dramatically effective in 1918, so dramatically less effective in 1914?
Yeah.
What had the British Army done to lose the ability to fight a peer army, the German army, in a highly intensive battlefield in just 20 years? What had happened? And that's really what the book's about. The book's about trying to understand the practical things the British Army did or didn't do, the way of thinking, British culture, society, politics, economics. What were the things that drove the army to forget its past? And what did the British Army do in terms of doctrine, policy, training, and leadership?
And some of that we are going to discuss in this episode, of course.
Yes, exactly.
So, and one of those things that another thing that came out of the Great War, of course, is technological advancement, and one of those was the tanks. So let's talk about the tanks. And I'm not going to compare it to early cannons, because much like the early cannons you see in this 15th century weren't very effective. And to be fair, neither were the early tanks like Mark 1. So let's talk about the innovation of the tanks as well as the frequently, excuse me, in the book. As well. So let's talk about the tank innovation of the tanks as well, because that's an important factor as well. And I believe the early tanks was more for psychological warfare rather than actually being effective.
Well, the aim of the tank is a great question. The aim of the tank was originally to cross contested ground. It was to cross ground that was covered with trenches and wire. But it was, as time went by, people began to realize that actually the tank had greater utility and a greater virtue. And the reality is that the tank was very good at being the center point in which offensive action could be undertaken. Now, it just so happens that actually the tanks are a great center point for all action, defensive as well. But in the First World War, the tank, when it was was used, first of all, in not enough numbers to be worthwhile. It was then regarded by many theorists, both during the war and afterwards. I mean, this is one of the problems in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. People like JFC, Fuller and Little Hart, saw the tank as a machine of war, which everything else supported. And the argument was, if only you could get the tank moving in large enough numbers together in mechanical blobs, you would be able to overwhelm the enemy and create rivers of offensive action, all driven by tanks. Well, that was only partly true. And I think the great lesson that blitzkrieg taught us in 1940, but actually we had learned...
I'm not too late there.
Yes, a little bit too late. One of the things that we had learned, of course, actually by 1918, is that tanks needed to be coordinated, first of all, with artillery and also with infantry, so that small numbers of tanks could advance with artillery to direct fire artillery to attack bunkers and so on, and with indirect artillery to provide smoke screens and so on, to bring infantry up and to take ground. Now, it's very, very interesting that as soon as you bring those three things together, tanks, let's say the Mark IV tank, tanks bringing up supplies, tanks bringing up infantry, mobile artillery as well. So tanks are pulling field artillery behind them with aircraft who can spot where the enemy are and radio back to the tanks or the advancing forces to give them a route of attack.
Did they use birds as well as a form of communication in at least the early tanks?
They did. They used birds in the early pigeons in the early days, but this was not particularly effective. I mean, you aren't going to be using them in fast moving actions. But it's really quite extraordinary. When the tanks first came to the battlefield in 1916, then en masse in 1917, by 1918 they were being used in a very different way to the way they had been used in 1916. In fact, one of the most extraordinary things about the offensive in the 100 Days battles, which my friend Nick Lloyd has written extensively about, is the fact that many tanks were then not used as tanks. They were used to bring up supplies. And I think this is part of the developing idea that actually the tank is something that represents mobile offensive action. And that's the kernel of the idea that the German army picked up in the 1920s, developed extensively into their doctrine, which led to Sigelschnitt in 1940, which is that, okay, we need to be able to, the tank itself isn't an armored horse. The tank itself is the thing that punches through defenses, has enough power to keep it going, can be sustained, but is part of a wider military capability that involves infantry, air in particular, and artillery. And as soon as you bring those three together, you get less of an emphasis on tanks and more of an emphasis on a tactic. Now, it's very interesting. I mean, I am a student of war, and I've been spending a lot of time looking at the tactics in Ukraine, and exactly the same lesson has been learned in Ukraine. The idea that you can just send tanks in unescorted, either by the Russians or indeed by the Ukrainians, without being part of a coordinated group of offensive capability is a nonsense, and you're going to lose tanks if you do that. They need to be brought in together because they can only work in a coherent way. And that was, interesting enough, one of the big lessons that led to success in August, September, October, those incredible 4 months at the end of 1918, which drew the First or the Great War to an end.
But it's interesting. It's interesting to me that the tanks was almost scrapped. I'm not saying it was just Churchill, but Churchill was, of course, a big advocate for the tanks. He saw the value in the tanks. They were almost scrapped as a project as a whole when we saw how ineffective they really were in the mud and the trenches and of no man's land. So it's interesting how I'm not saying that it was necessarily just Churchill.
He was. I would suggest that he was probably the most important man when it came to energizing the arguments for the tank in 1915. And let me explain why I think that's the case. We bring this up a number of occasions in the book. We describe this as military imagination. So just imagine that you are an infantry commander in the First World War and you are in your serried lines of trenches and you are separated from the enemy by mines and barbed wire. And you're trying to imagine how to improve your position, your military position, your strategic position. You're trying to imagine how you might secure a strategic advantage over the enemy. It's imagination. It's thinking about how you might do it. There are very few generals. There are very few men in those moments and those periods of time of intense stress who are actually able to energize their mental capacity and faculties to think about what might happen. Now, it just so happened there were two dramatic types of imagining in the First World War. Well, three perhaps. Let me go through them. The first was the aircraft. And it became very, very clear to men in their trenches that aircraft could do quite a lot, not just to fight other aircraft, but actually to undertake reconnaissance, undertake photography, undertake aerial bombing in due course, and so on. And so the nature of air power then developed around that. And you then had bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Then you had fighters protecting them. So the idea of the squadron, not just these knights of the air who went off to fight each other because that was a very gallant thing to do. No, as a military capability, air was the one thing. Now, interestingly enough, the tank was the second. But of course, if you think about the tank being something that might break through lines and wire and trenches, that's the first part of the idea. It's not the full extent of what the tank can do. That only comes to you when you start practicing. And of course, this is all trial and error. But I still think that one of the most extraordinary things for me about the First World War, the Great War, was how quickly this change took place. Because we had the idea of the tank in 1915. A year later, it was on the battlefield. It took a year then for the tank idea as an offensive coalescing of capability to come to the fore. I'm saying these things because it's really important to understand that imagining the military ideas, it's the thinking power that I'm emphasizing here as being critically important, because the moment you stop thinking about how military force can be applied is the moment you go backwards and the moment the enemy gain an advantage. And I'm going to leap ahead here because I think that's exactly what happened between the wars. The British failed to continue imagining how to win what I describe as high-intensity warfare against a peer adversary. So an adversary like themselves. It's very, very calming. It's very comforting to think about only having to fight, as we called them, the fuzzy wuzzies, or people who didn't have the Maxim gun, the colonial enemies. It's much, much more difficult to focus on fighting a peer adversary. First of all, you have to persuade your politicians and the people who pay you that it's important that we continue to do this because another war might happen. Well, who on earth in their right mind in the 1920s and 30s thought that there would be another war like the Great War?
Unless there's stuff so with Germany again,
Well, I mean, I think the really interesting thing about this is that Britain certainly lulled itself into a false sense of security, definitely in the 1920s and 1930s, and said that the Great War would never happen again. And we don't need to worry about remembering how we won 1918 because it was an aberration and would never have to do it again. I think the really important thing is people were not considering, as they ought to have done, what Germany was doing. And a close analysis of German military history will demonstrate actually the Germans were horrified by 1918. They were horrified by the advances made by these combined armed blobs, tanks, infantry, and artillery coming together, bypassing their positions, bypassing strong points, and through the 1920s, the Germans said, "How did the British do it?" So whereas the British in the 1920s entirely forgot what had caused their victory in 1918, and didn't spend any time translating that learning into doctrine, either pamphlets that enabled subsequent soldiers to learn how to do it. None of that happened in the British Army. But the Germans did. The Germans spent a lot of time listening to JFC Fuller and Little Hart in the 1920s. They spent a lot of time, as you know, in Russia, renting training grounds in Russia, away from the prying eyes of the people who were policing the Versailles Treaty, and training with essentially whistles and flags, but developing prototype tanks. They weren't particularly interested in the 1920s and early 1930s, certainly not until the Nazis arrived, of building up large tank forces. That could always come later. But they wanted to preserve the memory and develop the doctrine of what Britain had achieved in 1918. And the great irony of this crazy story, Erlend, is that what Britain and the British Army faced in 1940 were British tactics deployed by the Germans. And it's really quite extraordinary. I mean, we spent a number of years writing this, and we just looked at each other regularly saying, this is really extraordinary. You forget your past as a soldier, and someone's going to do it to you in return. You have to be on your game all the time. That's a wearying task, and that's something that the British Army through the 1920s just gave up on doing.
So let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles, and of course, as they say, and you say in the book, the legend, it was the war to end all wars. Of course, we know it wasn't, because wars happened in the interwar years as well. We'll talk about that a little later. But of course, let's talk a little bit about what's the plan for the British Army, with what they're going to do with the soldiers and because if there was not going to be any wars, what were the need for an army if
Exactly.
this was the need. So let's talk about the disarmament of the British Army after the and again I'm going to bring up the Empire a little later, but let's talk about the Continental Army first before we go into
Okay.
the
Okay.
colonial troops.
Okay, well, there's only one real task for the Continental Army after 1918, and that was to occupy the Rhineland. Now, the Rhineland, which probably comprised about 18 or 20% of Germany as a whole, was the industrial heartland of Germany along the Ruhr, of course, and the Rhine. And this was denied to the Germans to be militarized. So there were to be no armed troops there at all. And in this respect, the Versailles Treaty was a good treaty. It recognized that if this great border between Germany and France was demilitarized and, in fact, was occupied by effectively peacekeepers from Britain and France, then France's eastern borders would be safe. And I think that was absolutely right and has been borne out by subsequent events, certainly borne out by 1936. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the first thing is Britain needed troops to occupy the Rhineland. All other troops came home and the British Army demobilized, lost about 900,000 men very, very quickly in 1919. But as you said, there were other obligations that came to us as a consequence of Versailles. So there were a number of German territories after 1919 that were mandated to Britain by Versailles. They were then therefore known as mandates. And this included, and not just German, but German treaty partners like the Ottoman Empire. So as a consequence of that, Britain was mandated Palestine and some other places around the world. And that actually caused some significant problems for Britain because whilst Britain was trying to demobilize from the war, all of a sudden we had an increase in military obligations. And your listeners will also know that in 1917, Russia had a revolution, a very bloody revolution, and Britain and France believed that a military intervention from Murmansk, right in the north, would be able to help the white forces and also in the Black Sea overcome the forces, the red forces, the forces of communism, and restore order and stability in Eastern Europe. It's very interesting when you have a look at those aspirations. I mean, in historic terms, when you look in retrospect, it's quite clear that Britain or France didn't have the forces capable of reversing the revolution. And one of the challenges is even if you're having an internal civil war, as soon as foreign troops come, that creates forces people to take sides in the home country. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. So anyway, but that was another incident or another occasion or more evidence of where troops were required. And now I just need to go back to this point. Many people in 1918, of course, in Britain, were absolutely delighted that the Great War was over. Soldiers said this was an aberration. The Great War would never be replicated. Nothing like that could ever happen again. And they could go back to pre-war or colonial soldiering, because the British Army, as I said at the outset, was a colonial army. It was an army that was designed to garrison the empire. And many soldiers, and there are lots and lots of memoirs in Britain that talk about this wonder and joy, actually, of going back to a 1914 army, an army that worked in the morning and played sport in the afternoon, an army that helped occupy India, an army that maybe fought the Mahdists in the Horn of Africa and the Pathans in the northwest frontier, and put down tribal skirmishes in Burma, things like that. It wasn't a continental army of the sort that we'd seen between 1914 and 1918. And it was an army where you could ride polo, you could play polo, ride horses. It was an army where you could live off your salary if you served in India. So it was very attractive. The problem is, as the army transitioned from this really powerful engine of war in 1918, it was really a remarkable engine of war in 1918, it forgot everything that had learned between 1916 and 1918 in its rush to become a colonial army again. And this was a great, great problem for Britain because as soon as you forget how to do things, the only way you get that knowledge back is by doing them again. And the only, you can see what I'm saying here. You don't want to go back to war to relearn those lessons. This is why military doctrine, for soldiers, ex-soldier like me, but soldiers like me, is incredibly important, because doctrine is about explaining how you fight. How you fight, it always has a why behind it. And the why is military experience. The why is what happens in war. We do things because it's happened this way in war, and we've learnt the lessons the hard way. And the next time we fight, we don't want to expend blood and treasure learning silly lessons again that we already know, which is why doctrine is a matter of taking that experience and listing it and presenting it and translating it into pamphlets and training manuals and teaching new soldiers, designing new equipment, making sure we operate in a particular way because we know that's what works in war. The moment you forget how to do that, you have to relearn it when the metal's flying again. And that's a very, very bad place to be. So just leaping ahead to 1940, I've just summarized the basic problem. In between 1918 and 1940, Britain forgot how to fight as they did in 1914. And it was not just the politicians' fault. I think Richard and I spent a lot of time when we were writing the book saying, well, who was to blame for this? I think it's very clear that there were two people to blame for it, two parts of society. One was the government for not funding the army. But I would say that's probably only 20 or 30%, because if you think about the German army, the Reichswehr at the time, they had no money. They were capped at 100,000 men. They had no tanks. And yet they were in Russia training along the lines that they had seen the British deploy successfully and effectively in 1918. So even though they only had whistles and flags, they wrote their doctrine, they carried out maneuvers, they trained and trained and trained and trained, so that they were certain that they knew that if the balloon went up and they had to do it, they could actually carry out 1918 type warfare very successfully. And as time was to prove, that's exactly right. Blitzkrieg was a British doctrine delivered very effectively by the new German army in 1940, which took over from the Reichswehr. And I think that's the real challenge, is that the British Army forgot. So although it didn't have any money, it was the British Army's institutional memory, I think is what we call it. How does the army think about the past in terms of controlling the present and dominating the future? That institutional memory was at fault. And it's because everyone was just breathed a great sigh of relief and said, wow, we no longer have to fight in a high intensive way again. This is marvelous. We can go and enjoy India and enjoy our soldiering in other places, and we won't have to worry that there might be another war like the Great War. It was.
But another thing I think we should bring up is also that, and we will come back to Chamberlain in a second, but, the British public also, I think, lost their taste for war as well. So there were no interest in doing a rearmament after the Great War. Like we said earlier, it was a war to end all wars. It wasn't just the public. We should take the British public into account as well, and I believe this was kind of probably the same in France as well. But we are focused on the British, that the British public were no longer interested in having war, being in the army, or being being conscripted into. There was no need for it because there was not going to be any more wars, at least in continental Europe.
Well, it's absolutely right. There is, as I said, in 1918 or in 1919, the first memorials or remembrances to the war in November 1919 were memories of victory. In 1920 and 1921 and thereafter, they were memories of sacrifice. And Britain definitely lost. The British population most certainly lost its taste for war. Britain, as you know, is not a warlike society. We don't have a military tradition. The professional army has always been small. Even during the Napoleonic years, it's been tiny. Very, very few people joined the army. As a percentage of school leavers, for instance, it's very, very small indeed. There is no culture of militarism. People know about the military because probably because some of our regiments are high profile and they guard the royal family and so on. But it's not a common thing. In the 1920s and 1930s, it even got so bad that if you were a soldier, you never admitted it publicly because you would then be regarded as a warmonger. The argument was, why would you join the army? Because all soldiers want is war. Now, of course, that's absolute nonsense. Soldiers join the army not to create wars, but to stop them. But there is a very, very strongly anti-military attitude in Britain. There always has been, actually. It's a very interesting aspect of British society and culture, this anti-military idea. And it's gone back hundreds and hundreds of years, even to our Civil War in the 1640s. The idea of taking up arms on behalf of the state is regarded as not a good thing, which is why, actually, as I said, the conscription in 1915 that led to 1916 was really quite an aberration in Britain. And it has only ever happened again during the Second World War. Huge changes as a consequence. You're right, people did not want war.
Now, keep in mind, if I remember correctly, Churchill, of course, again, was in political exile in this time until he became prime minister. But he was one of the few actually wanted to rearm the British army, and he saw the value in having a army. And of course, like I said, he was in political exile at the time, so he didn't really have a voice in the matter. But he was one of the few who actually saw the danger in not having a continental army on the religious ground.
Yeah. Well, and that's absolutely right. But Churchill was partly to blame. I mean, it's not easy, and it doesn't really help applying blame. But when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was the finance director of the United Kingdom in the early 1920s. He instituted what was known as the 10-year rule, and the 10-year rule assumed that there would be no war for 10 more years, and it was a rolling 10 years. So 4 years on, there would be no more. There'd be no war for the next 10 years. So actually, after 9 years, you got to the point of saying, well, there'd be no war for the next 10 years, which meant that the whole period was 19 years. And all that meant was that if there was going to be no war in the next 10 years, you didn't need to have a spending plan to make improvements to your defense investment. So there was no requirement for new types of tanks, new types of aircraft, expensive activity, and so on. And your army was kept on a tight rein in terms of funding. And that was the problem through the 1920s. There were a number of very bright, and we articulate this or explain this in our book, very bright Armored Corps officers who saw the need to create military doctrine around the tank and how the armored division worked in battle. One of them was a man called Charles Broad, who produced two very, very fine documents in the early 1930s called the Purple Primers. But there was only ever one Armored Corps exercise in the 1930s. And because they were expensive, they were all cancelled. No one really saw the need to develop doctrine in the same way that the Germans were doing, because the link between the potential to fight a new war and 1918 had completely been lost. So we have a real challenge here. Winston Churchill, yes, he recognized that Germany, particularly under Nazism, was a threat. So we're talking about from 1933 onwards. But British public attitudes and British political attitudes were what I would describe as somnolent, i.e. they were very sleepy. And the need to defend ourselves against a resurgent Germany wasn't understood. In fact, there were probably 3 or 4 people who understood and made a noise about it. One was a man called Robert Vansittart, who was the permanent Undersecretary of State for the Foreign Office. He was eventually sacked. His view was that the Germans, forget about the Nazis, the Germans were always a threat, and because of their militarism. He was a good guy, Robert Vansittart, but he got hold of the wrong end of the stick. He thought it was about the Germans rather than Nazism. Winston Churchill always saw Hitler and Nazism to be a dramatic threat, as did Anthony Eden, also a member of the Conservative Party and a great friend of Churchill. So those three people themselves were, I mean, Robert Vensat lost his job in the Foreign Office, but as a consequence of Churchill's determination to stand on principle here and to keep on banging the drum about the need to rearm, he stayed in the political wilderness until 1940, which is really quite extraordinary. And I look back on Winston Churchill now, he was one of Britain's greatest ever politicians. He was the man who frankly saved us in 1940 because he stood firm on principle. That principle was that we need to defend ourselves, the world need to defend ourselves against Nazism, because if we didn't do it, Nazism would conquer everybody. And once you're defeated forever. And that was Winston Churchill, quite extraordinary. But no one's perfect. And this is a real challenge, isn't it? Winston Churchill came in late as to cabinet in 1940, and many of the mistakes that had been made, some of the mistakes had been made at his urging. But if it wasn't for Winston Churchill, certainly we would not have won. We would have not have fought the Second World War. It was Winston Churchill's determination to stand that saved us.
Another man that saw this, of course, was, I want to kind of just mention him briefly, William Shirer, the American journalist, and of course most famous for the rise and fall of the Third Reich, and I think most people's first introduction to Nazi Germany. But he, of course, saw this as well when he was stationed in Germany, pretty much throughout the entire Nazi reign of the Third Reich, and he very well knew what was going on.
Yeah, and lots of Americans did as well. Years ago, I wrote a book called Under a Darkening Sky. I think in the UK it was called The Rise of Fascism. And so what I did is I just took what Americans were saying about Germany and Hitler from the 1930s onwards across Europe. And William Shirer, what an amazing man, was a beacon in the wilderness. I mean, he articulated the concerns of many in the journalistic community through the 1930s. Unfortunately, the problem with the 1930s is that a lot of people, like William Shirer and a whole bunch of other Americans, also were regarded by people at home as being too liberal. They were all, that today they'd be described as woke, perhaps, but they were regarded as liberal, and some were regarded as unbalanced. William Shirer was dismissed by many as being unbalanced, and yet he could see with a degree of perspicacity that is unusual at the time. But in my book, Rise of the Third Reich, I looked very hard to find Americans who supported in Europe German policy. And they were
I mean, John F. Kennedy is one of the most famous one, of course.
Yes, exactly right. And he was, and there were some very powerful ones. And of course, we need to recognize that in America, there was a very, very large pro-German element. And the America First movement was very, very strongly against any form of intervention abroad or military adventures. And were people like... there were lots and lots and lots of very famous Americans who supported Hitler, quite extraordinary. But in Europe, the journalists didn't. They saw the threat of Nazism for what it was. And we talk about, Richard and I talk about Richard Shirer and a few others in the book in terms of raising the alarm bells as to what was happening in Germany.
Now, let's talk about the rise of Germany and, of course, why the rearmament of Germany, because this is, we talked a little bit about this, how they trained in Russia and how they would use the British tactics. But let's talk about the rise of Germany, and especially I want to bring up as well the annexation of Czechoslovakia, because, from what I believe William Shirer's biographer, William Manchester, writes in his biography how had they actually done in 1930s, I think it was 1936, sorry if I don't remember exactly, but I think if they had gone in against Germany then, and I think Hitler as well recognized this, that they would have been defeated, and they would, the war could have gone entirely differently had they actually gone in against Germany in 1936 when he annexed Czechoslovakia.
Completely agree, and Richard and I agree with William Manchester. Our view was that so there were two dates. 1936 was the first and most critical one with the Rhineland, and 1938 was Czechoslovakia. It's very interesting here that what happened was that in 1936, Adolf Hitler decided unilaterally to reject the Treaty of Versailles and to reoccupy the Rhineland, that 20% of Western Germany that abutted France, and that was especially designed by the Versailles Treaty to be empty of German troops. In 1936, he said, "I'm going to reoccupy the Rhineland." Now, why did he say that? Why did he want that? Well, we need to remember that Hitler in 1930, had seized control of Germany as Chancellor by subterfuge. In the prior elections, his party had only secured 3 or 4% of the popular vote. He was very widely disliked, and yet by 1933 he was Chancellor. And in order to be able to win over a whole swathe of elite opinion in Germany, he had to bring them on side. He had to give them what they wanted. Now, I'm not suggesting that the aristocracy wanted war, but certainly having a bold defensive and capability was important. Building up the army was incredibly important. Giving money to industrialists to rearm was also important. It was, you kill two birds with one stone. But also the really important thing that Hitler did, possibly by accident, was his idea of Großdeutschland, Rich and I talk about this quite a lot. The idea that German blood should define the borders of Germany. Versailles did not and should not define the borders of Germany. Germany actually existed wherever there was German blood. And that was what Hitler described as Großdeutschland. In his 1921-22 Nazi Party proclamation, this is a really significant part of it. And of course, part of the idea of German blood was pure Aryan blood, not Jewish blood. So there's a real challenge here. But the point is that Hitler, by 1936, Hitler had to prove that he had military muscle and military strength. And he decided unilaterally to overturn the strictures of the Versailles Treaty by marching into the Rhineland. Now, we know subsequently that he was terrified, and that's the right word to use. He was terrified of the French or British reaction. He needn't have been afraid because both France and Britain did not have the political wherewithal or sense to actually reject that militarization. What they should have done is sent troops immediately into the Rhineland with fixed bayonets to force the Germans back and to keep it demilitarized. And we know that if they'd done that, Hitler would have called his troops back. Now, if Hitler had called his troops out of the Rhineland in 1936, I can see no way in which we would have had the Second World War in the way that we had it. Hitler would have had to constrain his aspirations, but in other ways. But as Churchill kept on
and same
saying,
goes for Czechoslovakia as well, right?
Exactly the same. Exactly the same. The problem is, with the Rhineland and the Anschluss with Austria and the Czech Republic in 1938, Hitler thought that he had a free hand, and he started believing in his own strategic greatness. And he started recognizing actually the influences of weakness in France and Britain. Now, Britain in 1936 did not have a mobile capability, didn't have the capability of sending a division back into Germany because Britain had demilitarized, demobilized so much. And France, although it did have the troops available, didn't have the political will to push back against Germany. So you can see here, 1936, the very strong roots of appeasement. The idea is, let's not make the Germans angry. Let's not make Hitler angry. Let's give him a little bit. Churchill used to call this feeding the crocodile. He said, the problem with feeding the crocodile little bits of the Rhineland or Austria or to Czechoslovakia is that when you run out of things to give him, he's going to gobble you up. And that's exactly what happened. And I think this is a really important point about Putin in Russia and Ukraine. If he is not resisted in Ukraine, who can tell what the extent of his aspirations might be
Yeah,
elsewhere in Europe? A line needs to be drawn in the sand. And if Ukraine can't draw the line in the sand because it's too weak, then Ukraine's neighbors in Europe need to do that as well. And that's a very clear lesson from 1936. And it's a lesson that I teach regularly, I speak about regularly in my lectures. That 1936 was a point, a really important test point in history, where we could, the West, have stopped the Second World War ever happening at all. And it's a very, I'm just going to sneeze, sorry.
that's fine. Don't worry.
No, I'm not going to sneeze. It's a very important lesson for all of us. I mean, the consequence of political action, we often lose sight of what the long-term political consequences of diplomatic action could be, or military action, because we can't see into the future. But look, I'm a historian. We know enough about how it works in the past to be able to say, you need to be able to do this in order to stop that happening. Stop bad behavior in the international arena now, and you will prevent war in the future. This is why, Europe has a collective defense agreement in the form of NATO. Even if the United States and Canada weren't part of it, and I don't see that happening any day soon, Europe would still need a collective defense agreement, because we all recognize that staying in a security club together gives us tremendous advantages if we're threatened, or if one of us is threatened. And that's the way that Europe was picked off by the dictators. And we need to remember the actions of one dictator often encourage those of a third, a second and a third. And it's not just Hitler we should be worried about, and we were in the 1930s. It was Stalin, and it was Mussolini. And there are a few others as well.
I mean, maybe not Mussolini too much, to be fair.
Not at the beginning, but certainly by 1940. Yes, he was jumping in on the action.
So let's talk about the declaration of World War II, and of course what would lead to the Dunkirk evacuations, because and talk about how Britain would so rapidly again have to rearm as they declared war on Europe. Sorry, war on Germany, not Europe, but war on Germany.
Well, I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about what happened in 1939. So on the 1st of September, Germany attacked Poland, and within about 24 days, the entirety of Poland had surrendered. And much of what we now describe as blitzkrieg was first exploited then. But Germany had significant advantages because it was able to attack into Poland from 3 different directions. And it was very hard for the Poles to be able to resist. The principle of preventing the German crocodile eating any more states in Europe had been agreed. And on the 3rd of September, France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. But the British military mind, and indeed the French military mind, assumed that when war resumed, if it did indeed resume in France and the Low Countries, it would resume in the same way that it had done in 1914, not 1918. And this was a very significant failure of what we describe as military imagination. Why on earth would the war begin as it did in 1914? It was definitely going to start again with one side exploiting the knowledge of 1918. And that side, of course, was Germany. And when the German Plan Yellow began in 1940, it exploited all the principles of movement, combined arms warfare, and so on, that had been executed perfectly in 1914, and which had been learned by the Germans and trained by them assiduously. And as I said right at the outset, the real irony about 1940 was that Britain and France had no idea what was happening to them. If you read all the memoirs, all the reports of the time, those dramatic 6 weeks in May and June 1940, where the German army was advancing through the Ardennes and then sweeping around to the north of Paris, and the British had no idea that what they were doing was driving to the sea in order to cut the British off from the French and defeat their armies without destroying their armies. This is a really important aspect of warfare. Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, said the epitome of generalship is defeating your enemy without fighting him. By that he meant you didn't have to kill your enemy in order to achieve victory. There are other ways of achieving victory. And the Germans achieved quite significant victory. They captured France effectively in those 6 weeks. They defeated Britain. Britain went into France in October, November 1939, expecting a war of linear defenses.
It's interesting that they called it the Boer War in the early first few weeks. But I also want to ask as well, because Hitler, I believe, if I remember correctly, kind of regretted not starting the war a couple of years earlier. He believed that he actually would have had the upper hand had he started the war earlier. So, what are your thoughts there? I mean, that's just
well,
earlier.
I think it's true. I think it's very interesting. It's a difficult one to know. I think he would have had a significant advantage because those years from 1938 to 1940, Britain rearmed dramatically. Now, we rearmed by building some bomber aircraft that weren't very good, but we also fortunately built lots of fighter aircraft as well, the Hurricanes and Spitfires. But we didn't build any tanks. We didn't develop our land tactics or doctrine. We had no idea what to do until the Germans actually attacked us in France in 1940. We built lots of radar stations and so on. So that delay was very important for Britain. But it was quite extraordinary that I think that German tactics and the capacity they had to invade France and maybe attack the United Kingdom was probably premature, because you need to remember that when they attacked in 1940, they had a lot. Actually, they were already utilizing a lot of Czechoslovak and Austrian capability. So the Austrian army had been merged with the Wehrmacht, and it's hard to say, but I suspect they would have secured some advantages. They possibly could have defeated France in the same way that they did in 1940. Remember also that Plan Yellow, this great wheeling plan through the Ardennes, was only applied at the last minute by accident through men like Guderian and Manstein, because the original plan the Germans thought was compromised. The original plan was to advance through the Low Countries. It was designed to be a war of movement, but it certainly was nowhere near as radical as Plan Yellow, which was this great freewheeling move through the Ardennes, which was designed to shock and discombobulate the Allies in northern France, which worked unbelievably well.
Almost exact same as they did in 1914.
Almost exactly the same. And the problem with 1914 is that the question was, how do you actually create the breakthrough at the point of the spear, and how do you then sustain it? So you had these long rolling battles in 1914 that were very bloody, and then they withdrew all the British to Mons. In 1940, the Germans had largely conquered that through amphetamines, but also working out tactics to destroy the defences in the block with air power, Stukas, and tanks and infantry and artillery, and then breaking through this deluge, this blitzkrieg that drove for the rear, left everything that it saw on the side. It could wither on the vine. It could be dealt with by others. The idea was to get into the depth of the enemy and cause confusion and chaos and this wonderful English word, discombobulation. Really, this shock. I mean, what are you doing? How, if all of a sudden you've got German tanks in your rear areas, how do you deal with them? But going back to your original point, it's difficult to know whether Hitler would have been successful in 1938 and 1939 in France, but there's a good chance he would have done.
Something we haven't discussed, I want to bring this up, is how what do you call the marginal line that were created in the interwar years? A failure, or what do you call it? What are your thoughts on where was it effective at all? It didn't seem more like a failure of the marginal line than it actually was useful.
Yeah, the Maginot Line was. Do you know what? It's a difficult one. Maginot Line was a failure because The Germans simply, as you know, simply bypassed it. But the Maginot Line, and the Maginot Line also was a failure because it enabled the French to believe that they were safe and secure behind this vast defense that had been placed to protect them from the Teuton hordes. So there's a mental thing going on here as well. As soon as you start being defensive, you lose the initiative. There is a thing that soldiers talk about, which is the best form of defense is offense. So if you're threatened, the best thing to do is to attack. And there are many, many, many good examples in battle of enemy attacks being destroyed by counterattacks at the same time. So the best form of defense is offense. And what the Maginot Line in France was, it created a defensive mentality in France. And it meant that when the Germans looked at their plans, they said, well, we're just going to bypass it, because the Maginot Line ended at the Ardennes. It didn't carry on into Belgium. And the Belgians, I mean, are quite extraordinary. I mean, this is my point about collective defense. In 1940, and until war came, there was no agreement between France and Belgium and Britain to defend each other. And Britain was not allowed to send troops into Belgium until basically the war began, and then all rules were off, which was absolutely crazy, because the Belgians and the Dutch stood on their neutrality, despite that neutrality being the one thing that would enable the Germans to secure an advantage in northern France. But even when the Germans arrived, the British plans were not very smart. It was let's create lines of defences like 1914, 15, and 16 to fight trench warfare again, which is embarrassing, really, to consider it now. But that's
I think you already kind of answered the question in this episode, but I want to ask anyway. What could the British Army have done differently to avoid the entire situation with Dunkirk and with the occupation of France as a whole? And what could they have done differently to rearm? Maybe not 900,000 as they were in 1918, but at least have a substantial amount of army. And I probably already answered my own question, but it's
I think
what are your thoughts? What they could have done differently compared to what happened with the evacuation at Dunkirk and the failure to keep France out of German hands?
No, it's a great question. I mean, we've touched on it, but let's summarize now. What the British Army should have done was it should have retained the ability to think about fighting a high-intensity campaign against a peer adversary like the Germans through the years of peace, through the 1920s and 30s. And it could have done that by having a small army that trained hard, that trained with modern technology, that trained in what we'd now describe as combined arms maneuver, so infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft moving together in the offensive and operating in the defense. So, and writing this doctrine down. You know, there was no lessons learned exercise in the British Army from the Great War until 1932, the Bartholomew Report, which starts off well. The first few pages are great, but the rest of it then dribbles into insignificant commentary on small tactical minor things, without realizing actually that there's a huge lesson from success in 1918 that people in the 1930s just don't understand. They just don't get it. So it goes back to Erlend, this point that I was making earlier about imagination. You've got to be able to imagine, think about how war might be fought and prepare for it. That's actually the reason why Richard Dannett and I wrote the book. We wanted to, we have been afraid that over the last 10 years, the British Army has been losing its way and has been not focusing as it should do on the need to fight peer adversaries in a high intensity, sustained way in Europe. At the same time, as we've got a mad totalitarian under Vladimir Putin charging around in Ukraine. So we've got the evidence in front of us of this crazy behavior. And yet in the British Army, we seem to have forgotten the need that one day it might be required of us, as it was in 1939 and 1940, to fight this sort of enemy. And in 1940, if we had at least trained and understood the nature of what I describe as this form of maneuver warfare, we would have known what the Germans were doing to us. We would have been able to prepare our defenses accordingly, like to launch counter-offensives against the Germans and so on. But we had no concept whatsoever. And it's very, very interesting in all the memoirs from 1940. People like Lord Ironside, who was chief of the Imperial General Staff, had no idea what the Germans were doing. And for months afterwards, they were sitting in their clubs in London saying, it's shocking. They don't know how the Germans managed to do it. To us, of course, as historians and as military officers, we understand military doctrine. We can see exactly what the Germans did. And it's a mirror of what Britain did in 1918. And the great tragedy of this whole story, as I said before, is what the Germans did in 1940 was taught to them by the British Army in 1918.
So I'm going to ask the same question just for 2025. What do the British Army need to do to prepare for a possible war against Russia, or maybe, I'm not, this is probably a long shot, but maybe even America at some point, if you could go that far. I mean, you never know with Trump these days, but
no, you never know. I mean, that's
just in general, what do the British Army need to do, and what should we learn from what we discussed today? And of course, in your book, that you kind of had the answer already, but what do we need to do to begin to prepare for possibly another continental war?
Well, the British Army needs to have a couple of maneuver divisions, so armoured and infantry and artillery divisions, so a division's about 15,000 men, that can operate in a sustained way in a modern battlefield. Not yesterday's battlefield, but a modern battlefield. It needs to be able to communicate securely.
Tomorrow's battlefield.
It needs to be able to fight in a drone-intensive environment. It needs to own what we describe as own the electromagnetic spectrum so that the enemy can't use it. So if drones are being driven by microwaves, we need to be able to control it and deny them to the enemy and so on. So it needs to be technologically advanced. It needs to be able to fight tomorrow's wars. Unfortunately, Britain could probably only, in my view, send a battle group for a sustained period of time, i.e., a couple of battalions, not much more than that. And it's a great tragedy that the British Army has got to the point it's got to. The British Army does have good doctrine. So the British Army knows how it can fight a division or a corps in battle. But unless you have the division in extant, operating, you can't practice with it. And my encouragement to the British Army would be to say, okay, we recognize that it's going to be very costly to create two formal British maneuver divisions. Why don't you create one maneuver division that's sustained, so you have two, and that you integrate that maneuver division in a NATO corps, with Germans or the Dutch or the French, so that we have permanent capability to operate a combined arms maneuver corps, so 30 to 40,000 men, which is the minimum NATO requires in Europe to defend itself from any threat from Putin or elsewhere, or God forbid from the United States. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, I would have been amazed at that question a year ago, but I'm not amazed now. It's really, really weird.
It's bizarre what timeline we're living in, but
yes, it is.
And one last question, of course. Now, my personal feelings about Starmer aside, do you think this idea about having peacekeeping troops in Ukraine is a good idea, or do you think that's just asking for trouble?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea because I think we're asking the wrong question. But Prime Minister Starmer won't ask me for my advice. But my advice to him is to say, you need to make peace first before you keep the peace. My own view is that there will be a peacekeeping force required, but it's rather presuming that we are insisting that Ukraine give up sovereign Ukrainian territory to the Russians, and I don't accept that is what we should be doing. It may be a necessity, of course, of a negotiated peace, that some parts of Ukraine are given either to the Russians to be part of that deal, or they are demilitarized and they're overseen by a peacekeeping force. But I think we need to go into it with our eyes open as well and recognize that the Russians aren't necessarily going to see NATO troops in Ukraine to be a good idea. And so it may actually, the argument that we have British and French and NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine might be something that is preventing a negotiation to be secured and settled. So we ought to be putting all our effort in NATO and in Europe in creating the peace, which means, in my view, supporting Ukraine to prevent Russia achieving its military ambitions, because they are a dramatic threat. Military instability of this kind is a dramatic threat to all of us, even though it's several hundreds of kilometers away. It's we live under this nuclear tripwire, and it's incredibly important that that violence and military force are not used to achieve political ends. I mean, this is the old anti-Clausewitzian thing. Military force is only used to achieve political ends when you don't have political stability, when you don't have collective defense, when you don't have diplomatic agreements. Napoleon used military force against the Tsar, his good friend, because the Tsar refused to ally with France against parts of what is now Germany. That's what Clausewitz was saying. It's a tool for achieving political ends. We've grown up. We don't need that anymore. What we need to do is we need to secure our political agreements and then achieve our political agreements and then secure them with sensible collective defense treaties that mean that we will fight for each other if the balloon goes up.
100%. And I think we can round it up there, of course. We only thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. And of course, before you go, do you have any social media? If people have any further questions about this book or the topic we discussed today about the interwar years from 1919 to 1930, and of course, where can people buy your book? From victory to defeat, if they want to read more. We only touched the tip of the iceberg of what you write about, so do check out the book, of course. And do you have any links you want to share in the description? In the description now is your chance to share social media or any other works you wanted to share in the description below.
I think the best way for people to contact me and for me to have conversations is on X. I quite enjoy X, and my handle is @Robert_Lyman. I'm just checking that that's correct by looking on X at the moment.
I think so. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, and I have daily conversations with people on this subject and on others, and it's a good way to X is good and it's bad, but if you stay in your lane, as I say, it's you can have some really, really helpful conversations.
Thank you again so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you again today. And this has been That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be lovely. You can also leave a comment now under each episode what you think about why the Britain failed to rearm from 1918. Or if you have an opinion on the topic, feel free to leave a comment. If you are on Apple Podcasts, you should write a review. That would be lovely, and I love reading reviews of the podcast. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. You can also leave a comment on YouTube, and we are available on social media on Facebook. Sorry, not Facebook, but Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky, and it's all the same. That aged well. My name is Alan. This has been That aged well. I'll see you next time.